Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm talking to Chris Wallace, who is a professor in the School of Politics, Economics and Society, the University of Canberra. And she is the author of Political Lives, Australian Prime Ministers and Their Biographers, which is what we're going to talk about today. Thank you very much for coming on Afternoon Light, Chris.
Delighted, Georgina.
And it's lovely to be here at the University of Canberra in person with you. And this book has been such a fascinating read. Well, of course, I'm interested particularly in the Menzies part, but into this whole art of biography and the impact it can have on political lives.
Yes, well, it's actually a political history of the 20th century Australian federal sphere, cunningly disguised as a book on biography, Georgina. I find people are a bit reluctant to just pick up a book of political history, but people are fascinated by biography. Biography is one of the biggest selling genres in publishing, not just in Australia, but around the world. And folks, if you're interested in policy or interested in politics or interested in history, often a biographical project is the way to engage interest, hook readers, get attention, and in fact write what you would have written anyway, but through human beings that people can relate to and like to think about and draw lessons from.
Yes, I think that's right, isn't it? Because if you're talking about people, people are naturally interested in other people, but events can sometimes appear a little bit dry, even if they're incredibly important. But Chris, you came to this project after having done something rather dramatic with your previous book project, so I wondered if maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yes, well, this book focuses exclusively on 20th century Australian Prime Ministers and their biographers. But you're right, Georgina, in the preface, I explain how I got to this topic, to this research question. And it was the quite traumatic experience of writing a biography of Julia Gillard and then deciding to spike the book and return the advance rather than release this very balanced book, this very professionally written, well-researched, well-grounded book into a feeding frenzy that was happening at the time. When I started that project, Julia Gillard was a very successful Deputy Prime Minister, very effective in Parliament, strong in people's assessments of her as a person and a politician. But by the time the project was drawing to a close, she was under siege in Canberra from both the Tony Abbott-led opposition, which I don't need to tell you about, you and all your listeners will remember that vividly, but also under siege from a group within her own party, allies of the deposed Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And she was caught in this terrible pincer movement between the opposition and between enemies in her own camp who were literally tearing her apart. And I could see that my book, which would, released in a normal political environment, have been cause for interest, discussion, debate, including around some of the nuanced elements in it. But in this fevered atmosphere, I really felt there was a strong chance that those kind of talking point elements of the book could have been seized on and twisted and used to help destroy her prime ministership. And that was not something I really wanted to be party to. I thought, as a historian, as a biographer, it would be a misuse of my work. So rather than allow that happen, I spiked the book, I returned the advance, but I ended up working with this really good research question. Had other biographers in Australian political history faced my problem? So I then spent a long time going back and looking at who the prime ministers were, who the biographers were that wrote biographies of them in the lead up to and during their prime ministerships, books that could affect their career trajectories. I did not look at books written after they left office. So this book is about political biography as political intervention, and I was really testing what happened to me against the past to see whether it had been a factor before.
And did you find that any other biographer had personally pulled their biography for concern over the consequences that publication might have on the protagonist?
I didn't. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, though, because we're left with history with what's on the shelves and what we can access or what someone has left accounts of.
And you've been very public about this decision, of course.
That's
other
right.
biographers might have just kept a bit quiet.
That's true. And also I end the book by saying you could argue that that was a political intervention in itself. I concluded as an historian, as a biographer, that it would have been fine to publish in that circumstance if one as an author felt it was deserved and if one was prepared and intended an impact But I didn't intend that. I was just writing a scholarly biography, right? So that wasn't my game. But I did find in the 20th century there were biographies that were very deliberately political interventions. Not that the biographer necessarily declared that, but they certainly had that impact.
Yeah.
But not many, interestingly.
The Curtin one comes to mind, and obviously written in the midst of World War II, so would have had some, I guess, propaganda elements behind it. But we'll come to that. But just to finish up on the Gillard biography that wasn't, were there elements of it that you felt could have been used to attack her that in another context you would have been okay to have out in the public? I mean, her story seems to be pretty well known. My recollection of the period, there were things that were uncovered about her that,
Look, there's no smoking gun. I've been asked a lot.
Yeah.
However, Julia Gillard is a human being. She's flawed. I'm flawed. You're flawed. We're all flawed. And inevitably...
Well, speak for yourself.
Witty. So inevitably, a real biography, a work of integrity, is going to include the good and the bad. So were there some unattractive bits? Yes, there were. I think in a normal circumstance, as I said, that would be a matter of interest and debate. But it was so mad, it was a feeding frenzy. And the nuanced takes I had on Gillard's lesser episodes in her life and lesser characteristics would have, I think, just been bent out of all shape. And I think it was a pretty unattractive era in Australian politics, not one that I wanted to be an active participant in.
Fair enough. And I guess if you become a factional boss and a leader of your party and Prime Minister of the country, there are going to be a few bodies left by the wayside, at least political bodies. Your book deals with the first 100 years of our political history in terms of federation. And the beginning is quite interesting for its lack of biographies. Why is that, do you think, Chris?
Yes, that first chapter, when we start at the early Federation period, I actually call Absent Fathers. Yeah. It was so striking, Georgina. Such a contrast to US political culture, where campaign political biographies were a feature of US presidential campaigning from the inception of its democracy, as Jill Lepore has written so beautifully about. But here, crickets, very much like British political culture. Now, in our case, there were special additional reasons. It wasn't just our inheritance of British political culture as a kind of a dominant strain. It was also the fact we didn't have a domestic publishing industry, and we didn't have one for a very long time. Essentially, books weren't written or published in Australia. To the extent that they were written, they were usually published in London. So there was kind of a lack of an industrial base for that kind of thing. But I think there are important additional factors to reflect on, and that is it's hard to go back to those founding Australian fathers, if you like, and not be struck by the unifying theme among them, which is very much white Australia. And I think as Australians, as a society, even now, we're kind of a bit keen to skip over that bit. Also, there were many changes quickly in the Prime Ministership. Famously, the Australian Parliament had the 311s, as Alfred Deakin called them, the Free Traders, the Protectionists, and the incipient Labor Party. And it took a while for them to sort themselves out into two sides of politics. During that time, the personalities leading them, with a couple of exceptions, weren't people of intense interest. I'd separate out Deakin from that group because he did come to great note. But even with Deakin, there was no contemporary biography of him. And in the case of some of those early prime ministers, there weren't biographies of them for 100 years.
Were there political sketches written, though, about the contenders?
Good question. Really good question.
Because surely people were interested. You know, they'll go to the polls voting for Deakin or Barton or Fisher. There must have been some query about who these individuals were.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? Especially since there was no radio and television at the time.
Yeah.
I think maybe Bruce was the first Prime Minister to have kind of regular newsreels shown about him. Yeah, you would think so. And there were these great people called journalists. And in fact, journalists emerge as kind of the heroes of the book, really, because it turns out that nearly all of the scant amount of political biography we got, contemporary political biography we got in the 20th century, was nearly all written by journalists. And those early Australian parliaments that sat in Melbourne until the parliament was opened in Canberra had a press gallery, had dedicated journalists reporting them very well, and a couple of them really stood out. Herbert Campbell-Jones and Alfred Buchanan, they wrote wonderful pen portraits, not just of the early prime ministers, but often cabinet ministers and unusual other politicians. Really wonderful pen portraits, including the clay feet, great anecdotes, great colour, that really bring these people to life. But they never got published. So in researching the book, I'm facing this kind of desert in the early period, and then I strike these absolute pieces of gold, but tucked away in the manuscript collection at the National Library of Australia, never read by the Australians who could have really enjoyed and benefited from reading.
So they weren't even being published in the newspapers?
Well, of course, these people
sketches
would have been reporting and being published at the time, but you know what it's like. We love reading profiles, and it wasn't really part of the reporting culture in that period. And these journalists were actually concerned that posterity had forgotten these people, almost even in their own time. That's how quickly these political leaders were just filed away into the used up bin. I think it was Malcolm Fraser's press secretary, David Barnett, who used to say, Australians use prime ministers like they use Kleenex. They use them and then they throw them away. And Buchanan and Campbell-Jones were really concerned that contemporary knowledge and memory was going to be lost. They wrote these great accounts, but no one wanted to publish them. Thank God they've survived the NLA manuscript collection. One of these days in my vast amount of spare time, I'm going to ask the NLA if I can perhaps publish them and do them as an edited collection, because it's great stuff.
So when did Australians start to become interested in political biography then?
Wow.
It certainly wasn't this first period, really.
Yeah. Well, can you be interested in something in advance of being offered it? That's one of the big questions. Really, it wasn't until the Australian publishing industry began to grow in the 60s and then kind of flourished in the 70s. That's when things really changed. And that was, of course, part of our national segue from being a dominion to being an independent nation, largely. And thank God it happened. Otherwise, we'd still not have our contemporary politicians being covered properly by biographers. And there's a big public interest issue in this. We need to know more about politicians, about leaders, so that we can make more informed voting decisions.
But it's interesting, your observation that in the US context, you had the political biography as a sort of campaign tool. I even have noticed in Australia that we have less of a culture of politicians writing their own books or manifestos than they have in the United States. So every two-bit politician in the United States has written a few books about what they believe and their values, the future of America, and the answer to all the problems that they can identify, where they've come from, why they are the great man or woman they are. Whereas in Australia, current sitting members of Parliament probably count 5 or 6 who might have written a book themselves. Otherwise, it's pretty much bereft.
That is true. That is sadly true.
Or maybe not, sadly. Maybe we don't want those books. I don't know, but I think they're interesting.
Well, I think
to get a sense of the person's beliefs.
I think they're important.
Yeah.
I mean, when I wrote my Hewson biography, my first book in 1993, one of the main reason I wrote it was at the time I undertook that project, John Hewson was riding high in the polls. It looked like he was going to beat Bob Hawke at the next election. Of course, Labor had a leadership change down the track. That wasn't evident when I started the book. But really the only thing my colleagues, was then in the press gallery, the only thing my colleagues and I knew about John Hewson was that he was an economist, he drank champagne, and he drove a red Ferrari. And I thought, well, that's a pretty poor basis for people to maybe make this man Prime Minister. So I set out to find out what he thought, why he thought it, and what the implications for the nation of that were. And so if he had written his own memoir or his own work about himself and his ideas, I probably wouldn't have done that. I think there's a public interest function in politicians doing that. But sidebar on the US presidential campaign biographies, it's uncanny when you read them. It's funny, Georgina, just about 100% of them were born in log cabins.
Really? Yeah.
Which kind of makes...
You don't want to have been born in a mansion, do
well,
you?
This is Menzies' point. Menzies said that these kind of works are just propaganda. They're worthless. John Howard said in the interview he gave me for this book, doing contemporary biography, it's a dangerous thing for a politician. If it happens to you, it could well make it less likely you become Prime Minister, because you are putting out there in the public realm lots of stuff that can be used against you.
That's right. And you're allowing other people to craft a narrative about you that might not be the one you want and can be used to your political disadvantage.
Just one more thing on your memoir point. You're completely right about the way that works in the US. Politicians are very adept at structuring expectations and doing themselves what in their political culture is called dust busting, getting the bad stuff out, structuring expectations about them so that you're kind of inoculated against it. In Australia, in fact, there is a huge political memoir industry, but it's after politicians leave politics. So there's a young scholar at ANU, Joshua Black, who's doing a PhD thesis at the minute. He's just about to submit on political memoir in Australian politics from about 1970 on, and it explodes. So stay tuned. He would be another person interesting to talk to you for your podcast.
He will be. On to Menzies, who is yet another politician or political leader who doesn't have a biography written of him that's published during his active term of office. He had some views on biographies, didn't he, which I find quite enlightening and give you a real explanation into his reticence for the whole project. Did you want to talk about them?
He absolutely despised it.
Okay, that's one way of putting it.
He wrote very interestingly on biography. In my Menzies chapter, I include a lot of it because it is so interesting. Along the way, he sledges things like a cricketer hits 100, suddenly he's the greatest cricketer that was ever born, or someone politically stumbles and they're the worst politician that ever was. And he very much bemoans the excess in both directions of people's contemporary assessments. He essentially argues that in biography, it's just the extreme and worst form of that. You tend to get the hagiographies, all the damning dismissals, and in any case, you're just better off doing stuff and being judged accordingly rather than trying to manipulate and fool people through what he sees essentially as propaganda.
You have in the opening of your chapter on the Menzies biography mystery a quote from him where he says to overpraise or overblame the statesmen while they are alive and to forget them or forgive them when they are dead, which I think is pithily put.
He could write, couldn't he?
He could write and he could speak too. So he's famous for having been Prime Minister very briefly, 39 to 41, and then, of course, the longer stint, 49 to 66. But in that intervening period between his sort of rather disappointing first attempt at the Prime Ministership before the much more successful long-lived attempt from 49, he struggles a bit with what he's got to do. He has a lot of naysayers, and you see this through political history in Australia when people are in the doldrums. It's, they'll never win, they're a hopeless case, and then there's this John Howard-esque Lazarus Rising. The same happened to Menzies, and he's obviously entertaining how to recover his reputation. And when he is successful, it's not necessarily certain that he'll continue to be successful after 49. So he does entertain the idea of a biography, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. I reckon Menzies is one of the great unexcavated people from 20th century Australian politics in a way that you don't expect. I think he's kind of trapped in this kind of Liberal Party aspect in a way that stops a lot of people engaging with him in his career. And I say this in relation to people across politics. He is an absolutely fascinating politician, and history has served him poorly by compacting him into this kind of iconic political doll that's kind of wheeled out by small L Liberals, the small L Liberals remaining within the Liberal Party, and often cited by neoliberals within the contemporary Liberal Party who in fact have no idea what his actual political philosophy was. So he's kind of caught in this cage of internal Liberal Party debate when in fact he's a figure of immense interest across politics. And to understand why, you have to actually go back and understand his career. And I think the Menzies chapter in my book, if it does nothing else, I hope it reveals the human being and kind of breaks him out of being the political doll that people wield inside the Liberal Party and fight over. People forget that this most electorally successful politician ever in Australian politics was a crashing failure first time around. He actually wanted to and made active efforts to leave politics after that failure. Didn't, hung in, came back, and then had that incredible run from 49 to 66 as you say. Now, he had a particular way of doing it. He was not popular in his own party early on, and even later on, that was still a bit of an issue. He was very resistant to contemporary political techniques that were developing at the time because he was very much more an early 20th century kind of guy. And one facet of that was he did not want to have to talk to journalists. He despised journalists. He despised newspaper editors. He did not want a press secretary. He did not want to have to remould his image from the person who was seen as a somewhat waspish, acidic, unpopular, on himself failure. He then succeeded in seizing power off Labor in 1949, but he still wasn't popular. This is what's so great about history. When you go back and get into the detail, it's better than a Netflix series, honestly. After Menzies became Prime Minister in 1949, people forget he was still unpopular. People like Dick Casey, who early in Menzies' earlier Prime Ministership potentially been a rival, people like Casey early on in that second Menzies Prime Ministership were more popular than Menzies. And people in the Liberal Party were concerned that Australian voters, in their view, didn't know Menzies, and if they did know him better, they'd like him more. But also, they're actually concerned with winning elections. And if Menzies was unpopular, it was going to be harder for the coalition to keep winning elections. So there was a lot of concern in that early second Prime Ministership about how do we make Menzies more liked, more popular, and hence this Alan Dawes biography project emerged. Not something Menzies wanted, but Menzies was prevailed upon to understand could be necessary to help voters understand who he was better and to like him more and therefore be more likely to vote for him in future elections.
So tell me about Alan Dawes, because he is probably someone who unfortunately has been a bit forgotten by history. I mean, he's an interesting character in his own right, as I read about in your book.
Yes, Alan Dawes is one of the many journalists who feature in this book because they are the ones writing the first draft of history, right? Ironically, journalists don't understand it. They feel pride in writing the first draft of history. Historians look down on them for only writing first drafts, yet utterly reliant often on their accounts for doing a lot of their own work. So Alan Dawes was one of those great knockabout, essentially first half of the 20th century journalists who was a big personality. He ended up being physically large as well.
Yes, 108 kilos, I read.
That's true.
Yeah.
That is true. And he wrote like an angel, in the words of a colleague. He was a stunningly good reporter, a beautiful writer. He became nationally famous for his coverage of World War II from the Papua New Guinea perspective. And he famously, at the end of the war, there were two journalists on his newspaper in Melbourne who had to come and file on two parts of the war effort for a special edition of their paper. And the first journalist did their bit, early, orderly kind of copy. Dawes filed late. He arrived at the office completely drunk and then knocked out the best account, summation of the PNG campaign in World War II that anyone ever wrote. That was political journalism at the time. Even in my time in the press gallery, I won't name the journalist concerned, but someone who was famous for a long lunch would come back and file their column late and it would be brilliant and totally informed. And of course that changed in the 80s when everyone took up jogging. But Alan Dawes was one of these legendary characters. He was respected on both sides of politics. I think under Chifley, I think it was, he'd undertaken a tour of America with a group of other people for the war effort. So Labor had no problem with Dawes. But he was a journalist who tended to be a bit closer to the coalition side of politics. And he'd done some PR advice work for the Liberal Party headquarters on how they could do things better. And I think when the party was casting around for someone who might write, in inverted commas, friendly biography of Menzies, Alan Dawes was the trusted person, the good writer, who they turned to do it.
And he'd been a press secretary for one of Menzies' colleagues, hadn't he, when in the Menzies' first term as Prime Minister, Geoffrey Street, hadn't he?
That's right. And I think he also had kind of mild Casey association. So senior coalition people knew him, they trusted him, and they knew he could write engagingly.
And his biography project, that came after the Liberal parties had published a sort of a pamphlet, hadn't they, on how well do you know this man, a sort of pro-Menzies pamphlet, obviously. And I think you write about the Communist Party of Australia publishing a very negative pamphlet also on Menzies. So there was an attempt at the time, by the Liberal Party at least, to try and paint a picture. But obviously this full-blown project presented a really exciting opportunity to get some friendly, positive messages out about Menzies.
That's right. I mean, you raising that Communist Party pamphlet in response to the Liberal Party pamphlet, it underlines just what contested territory Menzies' identity was. Was he an utter bastard? Or was he the bloke who really cares about you and your family and making sure your living standards are going up? So obviously the Liberal Party had an interest in consolidating and extending and diffusing the positive idea of Menzies, hence this project, which, given Menzies' personal views on biography, he would never have agreed to had it not been necessary. And I think you'd agree when you read the chapter. You just get the sense of a little bit of grudging cooperation, would you say, rather than enthusiastic, great, let's get down and get this biography written.
Well, yes, it seems like it. I mean, this project takes place, you believe, between 1950 and 1952, and basically the intermediary is this press secretary who Menzies has very reluctantly hired. Stuart, we think it's Cockburn, but we're putting it out there. Is it Cockburn or Coburn? Please give us your feedback. So the press...
can I just say, Georgina, this is a big fail on your and my part.
Yes.
We both spent a lot of time in Adelaide growing up. And of course, Stuart Cockburn or Coburn was a huge figure on the Adelaide Advertiser. His daughter Kirsty went on to become a journalist. So, folks, save us from this embarrassment.
Total and utter embarrassment.
Is it Cockburn or Coburn? I think it's Cockburn.
Cockburn. It looks like Cockburn, but we're sitting in a city that calls Manuka Manuka, so we live in fear of pronunciation failures daily. So this press secretary, Stuart Cockburn, is an intermediary with Alan Dawes through this biography project. And you have had the absolute pleasure of getting into the National Library, to the Dawes papers there and Menzies papers there, and finding some of this manuscript. And what a ripping read it is.
Oh, thanks for saying that.
I enjoyed your transcription of it.
Well, it was a great, I think, great detective story. Stuart Cockburn, before we leave him, is an interesting story in himself. Menzies did not want a press secretary, and when he was essentially told by the party, you have to have a press secretary, you've got to have better press relations, essentially no one in the press gallery would do it. Menzies is Prime Minister. They approached senior figure after senior figure in the press gallery. No one would do it, and it's incredible, Georgina. One of the main reasons, apart from the fact that they knew Menzies hated journalists and they kind of semi-reciprocated, is very few senior press gallery figures actually believed Menzies would get re-elected. They thought he was going to lose the next election.
So finally, they thought limited job security here.
Exactly. Why go and work for that loser?
Yeah.
Right? And this is after he's won the 1949 election. So they're raking through their minds and lists of journos, and Menzies says, oh, what about that bloke I met in London? And Menzies on a tour of Britain had some dealings with Stuart Cockburn, and who was by then back in Australia. So that's how Cockburn came to be Menzies' press sec.
So it would appear that Alan Dawes engages in a series of interviews with Menzies and then sends through lists of questions as well for Menzies to answer in order to flesh out this biography. That's right.
So the setup was Alan would do this biography of Menzies, but it wouldn't look like an authorised biography, right? So, because if you say authorised, you know it's going to be one of those dreadful hagiographical bits of rubbish. So they wanted this to be a credible book. But in practice, it was a group production effort with Stuart Cockburn, well, Menzies, of course, himself, first and foremost, Stuart Cockburn, Menzies' brother Frank, and also his assistant Lenny. And so basically Dawes would interview Menzies, then he'd do transcripts, then he'd write chapters, and the chapters would be circulated and people would mark them up. And what survived in the National Library is far from the complete set, but enough to piece together what was happening and also to read Menzies' own annotations on a lot of the text, which tell you a lot. One of the things it tells you is he was getting increasingly agitated with Alan Dawes' biographical method, which was this. Dawes was covertly writing an authorised biography. That's the fact. He had to deal with the fact that there were very unappealing aspects of Menzies' record, as a politician in the Victorian Parliament, as a politician in the Federal Parliament, and also earlier in his life. And Dawes used a very standard technique, which is really effective, providing the subject would go along with it in this case, and that is get it out, say what it is, set it up, and then knock it over, right? Menzies clearly did not want that technique used. He would rather have things that were unattractive from his past simply not mentioned. And as the chapters go through, there are more and more kind of arcing up of Menzies on this, and you can just see Menzies going, what's in this for me? Part of the problem with the papers is some of it is in Menzies' papers, other of these chapters are in Dawes's papers, but in a bit of uber nerdy sleuthing, Georgina, which is the kind of thing historians do, and why we should love historians, because they're the only people prepared to do these mad kind of things. I was looking at the papers in the Dawes papers and going, what's the story with this? I just kind of sensed something a bit different. So I then researched the provenance of the papers. Where did these chapters in the Alan Dawes collection come from? And so I actually did the research at the National Library, internally in the National Library itself, and said, how did you come to buy these Dawes papers? And it turns out they were donated by Stuart Cockburn.
Very interesting.
So, in fact, we have no unadulterated Dawes papers. We have what's left to us has been left either by Menzies in his papers or by Stuart Cockburn. So we will never know what got taken out. But from what's there, we get the very clear understanding that Menzies became increasingly unhappy with the way Dawes was tackling the project. And then we get crickets.
And you get a list of proposed chapters, don't you? I think it's 13 chapters that Dawes is proposing to write. But in the papers are only 6 of those written chapters, and there's obviously the toing and froing with commentary from the different members of the group. So then the question you ask is, well, what happened to the remaining 7 chapters? Do they exist? Were they ever written? Or maybe it was just his work program that he hadn't quite got to.
Were they? This is the question. So what are the potential explanations? So when I went looking for documents, there weren't any to explain it. So what's the other circumstantial evidence we can kind of weigh up to try and reach not absolute but tentative conclusions about what was most likely? Well, the first thing is the Menzies office argument that Alan Dawes was a drunk and he simply couldn't finish the book. Now, that's a pretty big charge. Alan Dawes demonstrably and verifiably was a drinker.
Yeah. But you have the filing the Papua New Guinea story as an
That's
example.
exactly right. Yeah. The other part of that story is that he nevertheless performed at absolutely top level and at great speed and delivered. And that was the culture of Australian journalism at that time. You can drink like a fish, but you have to write like an angel, and you have to get it filed in time for the presses to run. That was a matter of immense personal pride, and Dawes would have done that millions of times, and there's no reason why it would be different with the book-length project. And we can see, in any case, from the surviving papers, that he was, in fact, getting on with the job. He was sending chapters. There were many interviews. So it's not like we can see a picture of a decaying, drunken person falling off their chair and not doing their job. We just don't see that. Nevertheless, if you read the Australian Dictionary of Biography entry on Dawes, written by an ANU, the late Hank Nelson, who was an anthropologist at the ANU, he just writes as a fact that alcohol got in the way of Dawes finishing this book. So I thought, wow, the Australian Dictionary of Biography is arguably the greatest collective social science enterprise in Australian national history. It's an incredible thing, and I'm a super admirer. And one of the things I admire about the ADB is everything is so carefully fact-checked.
Yes.
And you can go to the ANU archives and you can get out the underlying file on each person's entry and follow from the minute it's commissioned to the minute it goes to press, all of the correspondence and the documentation. Gold. So I went and got out the Dawes file and went through it. Absolutely no evidence for this assertion at all. And in the normal spot on the draft where you would expect to see a tick and a double tick to confirm the fact, there is no confirmation of this accusation that alcohol stopped him finishing the book. Very mysterious. So let's just park that there for a minute. Dawes dies in the, I think, late 60s.
Yes, quite some time after this project's abandoned.
Yes.
So he could have said something or published it irrespective of what Menzies thought.
If you're doing a kind of friendly with cooperation, let's kind of bracket that. That's a question mark over that.
All right.
Obituaries are run of doors, and one of the Sydney papers' headline is Menzies' Biography Mystery. And it basically says, Dawes wrote this book, Biography of Menzies. Where is it? Can it now be published? And it was certainly, when you read the obituaries, you do not get the impression of Dawes as someone who's become an alcoholic and becoming professionally incapacitated. Quite the reverse. So his colleagues didn't think he was a broken down old drunk who couldn't finish the book. So we've got that kind of suggestive evidence. We've got no objective evidence that that's what happened.
But just on the colleagues not thinking he was a broken man and incapable of finishing the book, there was also a culture at the time where you wouldn't have unloaded the dirt on a journalistic colleague, surely, for their particular foibles.
I honestly don't think they would have made such a big deal about where's the book had they thought themselves that
he was incapable of it.
That's right.
All right.
So I'm thinking, where has this come from? There's no evidence in the papers of declining capacity to produce. There's no view amongst his colleagues that he was a broken man incapable of finishing it. So what happened? If you look at the trajectory of political history at that time, something huge happened during the writing of this book. The Cold War built up into a really big thing. The Petrov affair happened here. Menzies used that to significant effect politically. And what happened was, I think, is that Menzies developed his own persona himself, his own way, through his handling of those issues, through the increasing profile of the Cold War and geopolitical issues in Australian politics. And I think, in the end, as a result, his polling went up very sharply, and he didn't need that biography anymore. That's the first thing. That's my thesis. We will never know, but when you look at the trajectory of his polling at the time, I think that's probably quite likely.
So he'd never liked biography. He didn't like journalists at all. He had gone along with the Dawes project begrudgingly because the party believed people needed to understand who he was and
keep winning
elections. And they saw it as a part of a political strategy. But because of the Cold War, Petrov, Labor Party split, all those things happening, basically it became unnecessary, and so it was dumped.
That's my theory.
That's your theory.
We will never know.
No.
But it's a plausible theory. The thing about plausible theories that make them dangerous is they may not be right,
yes.
right? There could be 10 other explanations. And
plausible deniability.
It's important to consider other possibilities.
Yeah.
But the Dawes was a drunk and didn't finish it. No evidence, not even suggestive. That's the first thing. Second thing is clear evidence of Menzies having a starkly rising popularity amongst the Australian population as the Cold War intensified. And of course he was up against Evatt, who his credibility was severely dented as a result of his behaviour in relation to the Petrov affair.
Well, Menzies was blessed by his opposition leaders, they always say.
Do you know what? That's 100% correct. That's a very astute observation. So yes, I think arguably the biggest factor is he just didn't need this book that he didn't want to cooperate with anyway, and they kind of let it run into the ground. Now, I only managed to find one other crumb of evidence, arguably connecting Menzies and this Dawes was a drunk and didn't finish the book argument, and that is Finn Crisp, the ANU political scientist, at one point is approached by a publisher to do something maybe on Menzies, and the Dawes book comes up in some correspondence in Finn Crisp's papers, also in LA. And basically he says he'd heard from a Menzies staffer that Dawes was a drunk and couldn't finish it, and that was the reason. So that's the only other crumb. It's only a crumb. So we will never know absolutely what happened, the answer to the Menzies biography mystery, but that's my best bet. I think Alan Dawes was probably traduced by history. Probably the Menzies / wider liberal political operation needed a kind of a fig leaf to cover what the hell happened to that book. And Dawes, being a big drinker, was easy to kind of label him that way. But the truth is, Menzies hated biography, he hated journalists, he was grudging in his cooperation with that book, and he just didn't need it once he became supremely popular in polling terms in Australian politics and could just let it run into the ground.
And the only other biography project that he cooperated with, the one with Francis McNichol, was also incomplete. She never published it, and there was a biography written about Menzies after he left politics by Kevin Perkins, but it wasn't one that Menzies had anything to do with, and he hated it. I think you're right. He said, there are 105 factual errors in it that I will be correcting. I mean, he continued his detestation of biography as a form, and it really wasn't until after his death that you get the 2-volume Alan Martin biography and other biographies follow, but he really was going to have none of it. Before we finish off this discussion, in the 6 chapters that are in the Menzies papers and the Dawes papers that Dawes does write, there are some pretty difficult assertions, stories that Dawes writes about, and some that Menzies is redacting, saying, no, you get rid of that, or phrase it a different way. For example, his contribution to the downfall of Joe Lyons. How does that play into the Menzies we know today?
I think it really underlines how much Menzies was a figure of a much earlier period of history. He, in those annotations he makes on the Dawes manuscripts, is really clear that if there's going to be a biography, he wants a Carlyle-esque biography of the great man. And those really Victorian-style biographies of the hero who has no clay feet, he's just this burnished, gold, shining, perfect creature. If there was going to be a biography, I think that was the only kind of biography acceptable to Menzies, which is, of course, ironic since that is exactly the propaganda-style biography that he hated so much. I don't think he was willing to go along with Dawes's updated method, which we recognise today. And of course, you see that in ultimate form in Blanche Del Puget's biography of Bob Hawke. Find the wart, shine the light on it, and then excise it. So it can't be used by your enemies against you. And in fact, the first time that happened in Australian contemporary political biography was in Alan Trengo's book on John Gorton after he became Prime Minister, which revealed at the time the incredibly controversial fact that Gorton was illegitimate. So I think it was a clash of timing and cultures in the Menzies-Dawes engagement. I don't think Menzies realised that Dawes was actually on the right track. But in any case, in the end, it was unnecessary because Menzies remade himself as a politician through the Cold War, and the rest is history.
Indeed it is. Well, Chris, this has been a fantastic discussion, and we haven't even got on to all the other biographies and political leaders, but this is just then an advertisement for people to go out and buy your book, which is a cracking read, and look forward to your next project.
Well, the thing about Australian political history is it's still largely unwritten. So I hope, if nothing else, this book enlivens people to the incredible excitement, richness, mysteries, and importance of this period to work in, to read more about, to write more about. So go forth and do it, folks. It's really important.
Thank you very much. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.